So we left off last time, we were discussing the halachot. We said when someone does netilat yadayim, they're ideally supposed to make the bracha before they dry their hands, right? The same way you make a bracha with anything. You make a bracha and then you eat. It's over la'asiyatan. So too, by netilat yadayim, ideally you make the bracha before your hands are dry because that's still part of the process. You're not, if you're in the toilet and you can't make the bracha over there, you go outside if you can. If not, you could rely on the chidah who says that you can make the bracha after you dry it. But it's more ideal to make the bracha before you dry it. If a woman wakes up in the middle of the night and she's thirsty, right, and she wants to have a drink, does she need to do netilat yadayim before she picks up the bottle? Or it's right next to her bed, she can just drink, go back to sleep? What do you think?
No, I don't know. I hope not.
You hope not.
I can drink. No,
You can drink?
When you say in the night before you go to sleep, you can say like if you wake up.
Every time before you go to sleep, you have in mind
So
he says, ideally, you just wipe your hands on the blanket or whatever it is. I think we mentioned there's a few different reasons for saying netilat yadayim. One is that there's ruach ra, there's bad spirits, and one is that you might have touched areas that are normally covered. Right? So he's going to go through in a second, but he says, she can, on the bed, on the sheet, on the blanket, just wipe her hands, and she makes a bracha. Yeah, it's if you're having a drink. She makes a bracha and she drinks. It's not a problem that she didn't do netilat yadayim before she makes the blessing, even though she did not yet wash her hand.
Does it make a difference making a baby's bottle in the middle of the night?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Good question. She doesn't, and says right, she doesn't have to like do it 3 times or dry her hands on the blanket 3 times the way you do netilat yadayim. Just dry it off. If she drank, right, when you make a drink, do you have to say borei nefashot on a drink or no?
Yeah.
What's the halacha? You say no, you're saying yeah. Depends how much you drink in one shot. If you take and you chug it, then you're supposed to make a borei nefashot. If you're just sipping it, then it's not a problem. So he says, even if you were to be really thirsty and chug it and drink a lot in one shot, it's not a problem as well. Besides making the bracha beforehand, to make the bracha afterwards, also not a problem. He says, right, nowadays, where most people are wearing pajamas, stam yadayim, we could assume that our hands are clean. Right? Back in the day, they would sleep either in nothing or whatever it might have been, and chances are you're going to scratch, you're going to touch. He says, and therefore, since nowadays more likely that you're not touching covered places, therefore you don't necessarily need to even wash your hands or dry off your hands before she makes the bracha. He says, in the summer, where you're more likely to be sleeping in shorts or whatever it might be, and therefore there are certain areas that are normally covered. It's not like the winter where you're wearing pajamas. Then if you're going to touch those areas, ideally you do wash your hands. So depends how you sleep, what you're wearing, what you're not wearing, etc. He says somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and she has in mind, I'm going to go back to sleep. I just woke up. I don't know why. Yesterday, my wife wakes me up at like 5:30 in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. She's like, do you hear that? I'm like, what? I'm like, is there someone at the door? I'm like, what? I look at I'm like, what is going on over here? I look outside, there's nobody. It stops. I get back into bed, 10 minutes later.
Squirrel.
It was a woodpecker.
I love saying it's the season. Yeah, it's the season.
I've never heard of woodpeckers in London.
Yeah.
It was a woodpecker. And they only do at the crack of dawn. They don't come at like 8 o'clock when it's convenient. And it was there at 5 and 5:30 and 6. I'm like, I'm getting a BB gun. Like, I said to my wife, if it comes back more than once, like I'm not having this. But yeah, so somebody wakes up and they got woken up or whatever it might be, and they're about to go back to sleep. They have in mind they're going back to sleep. Do they need to do netilat yadayim? If they have in mind they're going back to sleep, do they need to say asher yatzar? They got up and they went to the toilet. Do they need to say asher yatzar, or they shouldn't say it, but they didn't do netilat yadayim yet? Do they need to do netilat yadayim so that they can say asher yatzar? It's not like you're in bed, you grabbed the drink, you drank, you fell back asleep. You got out of bed and went to the toilet. So do you need to say asher yatzar, do netilat yadayim? So if you can rely on the fact that if you're going to go back to sleep, when you wake up, you're going to do netilat yadayim, and therefore it's not a problem. So you wouldn't have to do netilat yadayim, even though you are doing asher yatzar. We don't say, oh, you're impure, you can't make any brachot. It's not a problem because you're going back to sleep. He says, If you can wash your hands, then that's more ideal. But if not, then that's also okay because you're gonna do it in the morning. But ideally, you should wash your hands before you say Asher Yatzar if you're able to, right? And if not, then like we said before, you can just wipe your hands on the blanket, etc. Let's say he gives your question. He discusses. You want to put the blanket on the kids, or just put the pacifier, the dummy, back in the baby's mouth, etc. You do not have to do Netilat Yadayim. You don't have to say, oh man, I got to do Netilat Yadayim, walk Netilat Yadayim, put the pacifier in the baby's mouth. That's not a problem. You could just go and do it. Right? Someone gets up in the middle of the night and they're nursing the baby. My wife would get upset at me. They'd have like a newborn, 2 months old, and be like, does the baby wake up often? I'm like, sleeps through the night. She's like, you sleep through the night. This baby's not sleeping through the night, right? You wake up to nurse the baby, or to put the passy in, or whatever it might be. They told you do not need to do the Netilat Yadayim if you're waking up to nurse the baby. Right? He says it's an extra midat chasidut. If you're going to do it, it's a nice thing, and it's an extra thing. It's a midat chasidut. You don't have to, but it's a nice thing to do Netilat Yadayim before you nurse the baby. Some people also have the minhag that before they nurse the baby, what do? They make a shahakol for themselves, and also have in mind for the baby. Obviously, if your baby is nursing and saying shahakol, either it's a genius or it's a little bit awkward. But right, so for some people, before they nurse the baby, they'll take their own drink, they'll say shahakol, and then they'll have in mind, this is for me and for the baby. He points out, but if they're only drinking to say shahakol for the baby and they're not thirsty, then you don't make a bracha. In general, if someone's not thirsty, you're taking medicine, and the only way you get down the pills is with water. You need to make a bracha on that water that you're going to drink just for the medicine? No, because you're not drinking it for the purpose of drinking it. He says, so what should you do? He says, make a bracha, drink, enjoy, and then you take the pills afterwards on the second sip. That way you made the bracha for the right reason. It's a nice thing to make a bracha. But if you're making the bracha just for the baby that's about to nurse, also, don't make the bracha. It'll be a bracha lebatala. But if you have in mind for yourself and you're enjoying the drink, and then you also have in mind for the baby, beautiful. In general, he says that when it comes to little children, we need to be careful that they do Netilat Yadayim, mitam chinuch, but also not just from a chinuch perspective. Little children, their hands also might have touched impure places or have ruach ra. Right? It's less problematic by kids, but they also do. And therefore, he says we need to train our kids to do Netilat Yadayim. Sometimes you have kids, they wake up early, and you're exhausted. And they come downstairs, and they've touched everything. And you know that they're 3 years old, they did not do Netilat Yadayim. But you asked them to do Netilat Yadayim? Not yet. Now they went and touched everything. It's impure. What do you do? Is there anything to do? It says, if it's something that could be washed off, they touched an apple, and you can easily rinse it off, that's ideal, to rinse it off. If it's something like bread, where you're obviously not going to rinse off the bread. It says you have on what to rely, that you don't have to do that, but it's good to try and train our kids, teach our kids to...
From what age?
To some extent from as old as they are, because normally chinuch, you would say chinuch is 6-7 years old, they have an understanding, there's a concept of higia lechinuch. Over here, because they're touching impure stuff, and it has ramifications, if you will, even from the youngest age, ideally. Always take them, rinse their hand and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, teach them to count as well. And say Baruch. The same way you would do with almost anything. Okay. You can do it with Netilat Yadayim. It's a nice thing to do. And it's a nice thing. Some people say when the baby's by a boy, if you want to brit milah and the baby's yellow, it's a segula to do Netilat Yadayim for the little baby. It's different.
6 weeks and 3 weeks.
That's when you had your brit milahs.
No, I'm just saying.
That's when
Danielle is like very much more on doing this, and it hasn't worked.
but it's a good thing to teach them to do a tight dime. Again, some kids they're climbing out of the crib and they're making. My son, he was like 2.5 years old. He climbed out of the crib. He went down to the kitchen. He pulled out the bottom drawer, stepped inside. Now he's tall enough to push himself up on the counter. He opens up the thing with all the sweets. Oh. And my wife walks in. He's 2.5. He could like barely talk. She's like, Yitzchak, what are you doing? And he's like, I doing something else. I don't know what I'm doing, but it's not what you think I'm doing. Baruch Hashem. Some kids, like, they wake up early, they're going to go, they're going to play, they're going to touch. So if it's something that can easily be rinsed off, washed off, then you do that. If not, you have on what to rely. The bread, etc. You're not going to start rinsing off. He gives a list of things you're supposed to do in Netilat Yadayim. Some of these people don't necessarily realize, and this applies both to men and to women. It says El Dvarim shetzrichen Netilat Yadayim b'mayim. Doesn't mean a bracha, but you're supposed to wash your hands after you have these things. Hakam mitato, someone who gets up in the morning. Hayotzem bet hakiseh, someone who leaves the toilet. Bet hamerchatz, and after taking a bath or a shower. Excuse me. Hanotel tzipornav, someone who cuts their nails. Hacholetz min ha'alav, someone who takes off their shoes and their shoes are dirty. V'hanogea b'raglav, someone who's touching their feet. V'chofef rosho, someone who scratches their head. You'll see people, they'll scratch their head, men with a kippah like this or whatever it is. They don't want to touch areas that are normally, certain areas of the head that are normally covered. Ha'olech ben ha'metim, someone who goes to a funeral, mishnogea b'met, or someone who works at Chaver Kadisha and they touch a dead body. Umish mafrik kelav,amishamesh mitato, after having physical relations with your spouse. V'hanogea b'kina, someone who touches a louse or a creepy crawler. V'hanogea b'gufo, kumat mechusim, someone who touches their body, areas of their body that are normally covered. You scratch your face, not a problem. You scratch wherever it might be that's normally covered, you should ideally wash your hands. All these things you don't have to use a cup. Netilat Yadayim, you use a cup. All these things, you cut your nails, you touch wherever it is, you just wash your hands, put it under the sink. It's not a Netilat Yadayim thing, you need a cup, or that you need to make a blessing. Even coming out of the toilet, you don't technically need a vessel, a kli. You can put under the, you should do 3, but you don't have to do it with a cup. You just put it under the sink. These apply both to a man and to a woman. It says somebody who cuts their nails. So I've never been, but if you get a manicure, right? Does it make a difference if somebody else cut your nails or you cut your nails? Or is it only when you cut your nails? How does it work with manicures? Did you do Netilat Yadayim? You haven't touched anything. Somebody else has done it for you. He says it doesn't matter if your nails were cut. I don't know how it works nowadays. Gel, it is your nails, not your nails. I'm not an expert in these things. But if you cut your nails,
Sometimes they tell you to wash your hands after.
what?
Washing your nails, some manicure places have you wash.
I don't think it's because it's Netilat Yadayim from the halakha. Anyways, you're doing that, okay. But
I'm doing it anyway.
okay, good. So there you go. So yeah, Netilat Yadayim after you cut your nails. If you are a manicurist and you're cutting someone else's nails, you don't have to wash your hands. If you're the one giving the manicure, it's the person whose nails got cut. And he says it doesn't make a difference if it's your fingernails or your toenails. Your nails got cut, you should cut them. You should, wash your hands. He says even if it's just half a nail. The reality is you took off your nails. He says, which I found interesting, he says, but if you use your teeth and you bite your nails, then everyone's making faces. then you don't need to do Netilat Yadayim. You shouldn't be doing that anyways. But if someone
cutting your kid, like I clip my kid's nails and I
correct.
always end up with like.
So that's what we're saying. It's not about
even if I've been holding like.
Yeah, because it's not about the nails per se. It's about the actual cutting of the nails. Same way you cut the hair. The hair is not tameh per se. You know what I mean? But if you got your hair cut, then you should go do Netilat Yadayim. If you're the one cutting someone else's hair, then you don't necessarily do Netilat Yadayim. Right? I remember giving a shiur one time. I thought it was very interesting. Nothing to do with anything.
I always do it just because I'm always holding this. So I always think I should.
You can. You don't. It's a nice thing, probably just to wash your hands. But nails have an element of tumah. They say, you cut your nails, you leave it out, and a pregnant woman steps on it, could be problematic, etc. But I remember giving a class one time, and I said I was listening to a shiur, and the rabbi was saying, he said, if I was to ask you all over the world, the industry of hair and hair care products, $1 billion industry, maybe more, right? Nail care and getting manicures, all these things. He says in skincare, right? He says it's quite interesting if you think about it. When you get your hair cut, does it hurt? No. Why not? Because ultimately it's dead. It's dead cells. Only at the root is it connected. He said because it's dead. And when you cut your nails, does it hurt? No, unless you're cutting it too short because it's dead. And when someone goes to get acupuncture, do they bleed? Does it hurt? No. Why? Because the top layer, the top few layers of cells are all dead. He says it's quite interesting. We spend so much time worrying about our hair and our nails and our skincare, and ultimately it's dead. And it's like $1 trillion industry. I'm not saying don't worry about your hair. I'm not saying you don't. make sure you look good, of course. But it's just interesting to think about it. All these things, it's like we say in Eshet Chal, Sheker Achen veHevel Hayofi. It's just Hevel Hayofi. It's fake. It's dead. It's dead skin cells and hair cells and nails, etc. But when you do cut your nails, you should do Netilat Yadayim. Something to think about. Somebody who walks out of a cemetery, right? They need to do Netilat Yadayim. He says, but a person shouldn't be going to the cemetery unless they really have to, because there's Kabbalistically there's klipot in the cemetery. There's just bad forces or whatever you want to call it, and they can latch onto somebody, and therefore you only go when you really have to. It says if somebody helps a child, right, 2-year-old, talking about potty training or whatever it might be, right, you touch the area of a child that normally is covered. He says you need to wash your hands. They also need to wash their hands. And ideally you should use a kli. You have to teach the kid that they need to do Netilat Yadayim afterwards. It doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, but teach them, you walked out of the toilet, you wash your hands.
Sorry, how do we define what's normally covered? Like by society or by...
I think so. So I don't want to say only by society, because if you go to Miami and you say society, they're all wearing sleeveless and short and da-da-da. That's, your top shoulders is something that I guess we would say by standard tzniut issues, which for some people might be a little bit different. Elbows are covered, aren't covered, but an area that's almost always covered, you're going to start scratching over here. Most people are covering over there, right? That would be, you should start doing Netilat Yadayim. If somebody's touching the actual potty, if someone's potty training their kid in the potty itself, if it's dirty, you're touching something that's dirty, you should wash your hands. If the potty's clean, you just cleaned it, and you're touching it, and the kid never went. They just sat there in 20 minutes. You know how it is, right? But if it's not dirty, you don't need to do Netilat Yadayim afterwards. If you're dressing a child in the morning, right, little kid, you're dressing them and you're changing the underwear and whatever it might be, you're touching certain areas. If you're touching that area of the kid, especially if you're about to go pray or if you're about to go do certain things, make brachot, learn Torah, whatever, or eat, then ideally you should wash your hands. If it's things that, I guess this is sort of referring to, you were referring to, if it's something that by a child isn't normally covered. So if you have a newborn and they're wearing the little onesie thing, and even to the top of their legs, it's not usually covered, they're a newborn baby, or it's the summer and the newborn babies, nobody's wearing, there's no sleeves, that wouldn't be a problem, because that's the norm, especially for a baby. Just saying, interesting. The water, normally you consider the water somewhat tameh. It says if it's water that was used for Netilat Yadayim, that after you went to the toilet, if it's not, the morning water, if you will, is tameh, right? Because you had ruach ra, etc. But if it's just, nowadays it's not really applicable. But if for some reason you're trying to conserve water, or there isn't a lot of water, those days they had water carriers. It was a huge hassle. So they would try and reuse everything as much as possible. He says, it's not a problem, unless it was water that was used for Netilat Yadayim in the morning. After you slept, you could in theory use the water again if you want to do, wash the floors. Israel, they do sponja, whatever it might be. That's not a problem to reuse the water. So I thought we'd discuss an idea too, to get us ready for Shavuot. So, what does Shavuot actually mean? Weeks. If we were to get everybody together over here and say, you know what, we made a movie all about the revelation at Sinai, all about this miraculous occasion of the receiving of the Torah, and now we want to name this movie. Right? What name would you pick? Not Weeks. Right? You wouldn't go see a movie called Weeks. Right? Why wouldn't you pick the name Weeks?
Why wouldn't?
Yeah.
Plenty of other
things that are relevant. The weeks have nothing to do with the revelation at Sinai and us receiving the Torah. Chag Matan Torah. Chag, the big count up. Chag cheesecake is better than weeks. Right? Why is it that we name the Yom Tov Weeks? Right? We mentioned that we count up. Another question. When you're excited for something, what do you normally do? Count down. 10, 9, 8, Happy New Year, right? Or you might see on social media 6 days left to the wedding, 6. Everyone's got the 6 and then 2, right? You don't count up. It's just me seeing these things. Right? You count down. It's exciting. Why over here do we count up? Right? This time of the year is called Sfirat HaOmer. What is Omer? What would you say Omer is? What is this Omer that we're counting? Anybody?
Measurement.
It's a measurement.
That's it. Am I wrong?
An energy. Like an energy.
We're counting the energy. Right? People usually associate Sfirat HaOmer with no weddings and no parties. One has nothing to do with the other. The students of Rabbi Akiva dying happens 1,000 years after Hashem commands that you should count
Isn't it like
49 days.
Kedusha, so like it's every day is like
So that's what we're counting, that they went up in Kedusha.
like every day a bit more, or
So what is Omer? The Omer was a sacrifice. It says, "Uspartem lachem macharat Shabbat." You should count from the day after Shabbat. Shabbat over here referring to the first day of Pesach. Miyom haviachem et Omer hatinufa. From the day that you brought the Omer, the barley sacrifice, Sheba Shabbatot timimot tiyena, 7 complete weeks. That's why on certain years, especially here in London and places like Gateshead and Manchester, it's even worse. That might bring in sometimes Shavuot a little bit early. The ideal is that it's Sheva Shabbatot Timimot, complete. And therefore you should really only be making Kiddush, and maybe even davening, depending on who you go by, after, but over here in London, you're not going to start praying till like 10 o'clock. Start your meal till like 10:45. So a lot of times they bring it in a little bit earlier. They'll pray early, and then at least you make Kiddush at about 10 o'clock. This year, it's much more problematic, because what day is Shavuot? It's Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night. And therefore, there's no leeway to bring it in early or start early. So most people, their kids will be out cold by 11 o'clock, the time that you're able to, if someone going to pray and then you start the meal. But 7 complete weeks, and what happens? You bring a barley sacrifice, and you count 49 days, and then what happens on Shavuot? What do we do on Shavuot? Which sacrifice do we bring? It's interesting. Most Chagim, there's something to do. On Hanukkah, what's the mitzvah? To light the menorah. On Rosh Hashanah, what's the mitzvah? Don't say the apple and honey. Right? What's the mitzvah? It's to hear the shofar. On Pesach, there's a mitzvah to have the matzah, 4 cups of wine, Seder night, etc. Tell over the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Most Chagim, Yom Kippur, you fast. You have in Yitem and Navshotechem. What's the mitzvah of Shavuot? So that there's no mitzvah of Shavuot. There's a custom to stay up on Shavuot night. Why do you stay up on Shavuot night? It's called Tikkun Leil. What's the Tikkun? Tikkun means to fix. They must have done something wrong and now they have to fix it. So our rabbis tell us what happens. God comes to them and says, be ready in 3 days. Imagine I tell you, Daniela, at some point this week, someone's going to knock on your door with a check for £1 million. You're going to sleep? You're staying, waiting. She's counting the Prada, the Gucci, the Shaitos, the holidays, the houses, right? Not you, everybody. Right? You're not going to sleep. You're waiting by the door for the person to knock on the door. So, the Jewish people, it wasn't that they didn't know when. God says, 3 days, be ready. And our rabbis tell us, when Hashem came to give the Torah, what were all the people doing? They were sleeping. So to rectify that sin that they did, it's called Tikkun. The Taken means to fix. Tikkun Leil Shavuot. The night of Shavuot, we stay up all night. So I saw, I'm a big fan, you'll hear me quote often, Rabbi Shimon Schwab. So I don't understand. How can it be they went to sleep? They knew, they saw the miracles, they knew the purpose of leaving Egypt was to receive the Torah. How could they possibly go to sleep? Everybody's sleeping? Nobody's up? What's that?
They didn't oversleep. It was their preparation to be in a state of subconsciousness.
So says Rabbi Schwab, first name again?
Talia.
Says Rebbe Talia. What happened? The Jewish people, a few people had prophecy. Avraham Avinu, Sarai Imenu, Miriam. When they had their prophecy, how did they get their prophecy?
When they were sleeping.
When they were sleeping. Every single prophet, no matter how great, got their prophecy when they were sleeping. The only one who didn't is Moshe Rabbeinu, and God makes a big deal. Panim el panim. I spoke to Moshe face to face. When you have the Shloshes Ikarim, the 13 fundamental beliefs of Judaism, of those 13 fundamental beliefs, one is that Moshe Rabbeinu is the Av HaNevi'im, he's the father of all prophets. It was another level. Another level. All prophets, they only got their prophecy when they went to sleep. So says Rabbi Schwab, says Rebbe Tzin, what happened? They're being told God's going to come and speak to you. They said to themselves, must be, how's God going to come?
my sleep.
When I go to sleep. it was probably hard for them to go to sleep. They're so excited. They're about to receive the Torah. They're all having melatonin and teas to relax themselves. And everybody's sleeping because they thought that's the only way to receive the Torah. So it wasn't just like, they overslept. They were getting ready. So ask Rabbi Schwab what they do, or he says, so what they do wrong? I would think now it's a good thing they went to sleep. Why tikkun leil? He says, don't overthink it. God says, be ready, you be ready. People come to me, for Mashiach to come, this has that. I said, I'm a simple guy, I don't ask questions. God says, get ready, I'm doing my best to get ready. But this, but that, don't overthink it. That was the mistake they made. I'll go to sleep. No one asked you to go to sleep. Did God command you to go to sleep? No. Just listen to what Moshe Levy says. Be ready in 3 days. Don't start, we need to do X, we need to do Y. What is the thing in the times of the Bet HaMikdash they did on Shavuot? They brought the Korban, Shtei HaLechem. They brought the sacrifice, 2 loaves of bread. And our rabbis tell us, what is the idea of Shavuot? What is the idea of the Omer? Why is it that we're counting up as opposed to counting down? Our rabbis tell us, we were a bunch of slaves. And Hashem says, I want you to be ready to receive the Torah. The only way you can be ready to receive the Torah, who eats barley? Who eats barley? That's animal food. Right? Nowadays you go to the healthy places and most of the food over there is animal food. I think I told you, one of my favorite memes is I don't understand vegetarians. They love animals so much, why do they keep eating all their food? Right? There's certain foods, these are animal foods. These are animal foods. I spoke yesterday at a chuppah. I officiated the wedding. And I started off, I said, I look at the kala, and I said, you're here under the chuppah, and often I recommend that the bride should go to Eretz Yisrael and pray by the kotel. Did you get a chance? She said, no. I said, it's okay, it's not the end of the world, but usually I recommend you pray by the kotel, because before you get married, you should get used to talking to a wall. It's the way it works. I saw a meme. It said, ladies, if a man says he's going to do something, he's going to do it. You don't need to remind him every 6 months. Right? That's usually the way it works somehow. Right? So what's the food that animals eat? Animals eat barley. Animals eat certain foods. Animals don't eat bread, because to be able to get bread, there's a whole process. You need to plant, you need to cut it, you need to winnow, you need to grind it, you need to take the flour, add the water, add the yeast, put it in the oven for the right amount of time that it cooks, but that it doesn't burn. There's a process. Hashem says, you go from being slaves, you go from being animals, you go from being people who aren't necessarily what we would call ethical, moral, cultured, and have proper midot. And what are you meant to be doing? You need to work your way up to Shavuot. You need to work your way up to being able to receive the Torah. What does it mean, Shavuot weeks? I don't think anybody here has teenagers, but this is the season of exams. A lot of teenage houses, if you have more than one taking exams, it's just, and university students, it's stressful. They're stressed, they're freaking out. And as parents, you often tell your children, the success of your grades is going to depend on what? How hard you work, on how much you study. If you think you're going to show up and wing it, you're not going to do very well. Hashem says the same thing. The name of the Chag is preparation. The name of the Chag is weeks. Nobody would name it weeks. Terrible name. No. We're supposed to be like, what's with the name? Makes has nothing to do with receiving the Torah. You can't show up on Shavuot and wing it. You can't show up on Shavuot and say, all right, I'm ready to receive the Torah. The success of you being able and the amount of Torah you're going to be able to receive is only dependent on the weeks of preparation. So that becomes the name of the Chag. Are you going from animal to human being? From Omer, from barley to lechem, to bread. And it's all about the preparation. Why do we count up and not count down? When you count down, what do you want? Every day before the wedding that's in your way is just a hassle. You can't wait to get to the wedding. You're counting down to your trip. You're counting down to Happy New Year's. You're counting down to blast off. Every second in your way, you just want it to 10, 9, 8, you just want to get to the blast off. Over here, don't think that you're just getting ready for Shavuot. And on Shavuot, boom, I win $1 million. That's not how it works. Every single day is a day of growth. Every day you're getting 20 grand. And then at the end, then you get the million. But if you're climbing up 50 flights of steps, you can't get to floor number 42 unless you did floor number 38 and 39 and 40 and 41. These are the facts. You can't skip. It's the same exact thing with this time period. We're supposed to work on our different character traits, and maybe a different time. Remember, one year I did a series. There's 7 weeks. What are those 7 weeks? What are the character traits that we're supposed to work on? So the first week is Chesed. Second week is Gevurah. What's the third week? Well, that's the 5th week. Tiferet. What is Tiferet? Combination of both. But how do they define it? If you look in the glory, right? Maybe the queen is glorious, but otherwise nobody knows what that means. What's glory? Right? The 4th week is Netzach, which is eternity. The 5th week is Hod. What is Hod? Splendor. It also doesn't mean anything. What is splendor? Right? You could go through it. What is each one? This week that we're in now is Yisod, foundation, and next week is Malchut. Right? We say this, I don't know if you ladies say this when you daven in the morning, before the Azi Ashir. It says in the Vayivarach David, L'cha Hashem HaGedulah, referring to the Chesed, Ve'ha-Gevurah, Ve'ha-Tiferet, Ve'ha-Netzach, Ve'ha-Hod, Hichol B'Shamayim Va'aretz, the Yisod Olam, the foundation of heaven and earth, L'cha Hashem HaMamlacha, you're the king, right? Hashem has these character traits that we're meant to be emulating, but another class for another time. We'll work on ourselves, on our character traits. Why is it of the whole time of the year the students of Rabbi Akiva die specifically during this time period? Because on their level, they didn't work on their midot. They didn't work on their character traits. This is the time. Many people have a custom. They learn Pirkei Avot. Why Pirkei Avot? Because what is Pirkei Avot all about? It's all about working on your character trait. It's all about, so we learn Pirkei Avot. Don't think that I need the God to tell me what's kosher, what's not kosher, how to dress, how to act. Common sense. No. Even that Pirkei Avot is passed down from our fathers and our mothers, how we act, what's considered ethical, what's considered moral, etc. That's what we're doing. That's what we're preparing ourselves for. And every single day is a day of growth. Now, by the way, I think this is very overlooked and yet very fundamental. Daniela mentioned that the Jewish people, they left Mitzrayim and they went from a low level from the 49th level of Tumah, of impurity, to the 49th level of Kiddusha, of holiness. Right? Every day was a day of growth. I have to point out, part of that growth was failure. Part of growth is failure, as long as you learn from your mistakes. The 7th day, there's Kriyat Yam Suf, and right before the sea splits, what are the Jewish people telling Moshe Rabbeinu? There's not enough graves in Egypt. That's a fail. You failed the test. You complain. You just saw the 10 plagues and now you don't trust. They failed the test. The sea splits. 3 days later, what do the Jewish people tell Moshe Rabbeinu? Why'd you bring us out here? There's no water. That's a fail. That's a mega fail. But that's part of the growth. Part of growth is failure. Every single day is a day of growth. Right? The commentaries discuss. In golf, I don't know if any of you ladies play golf, but in golf, there's something called a mulligan. You ever heard of a mulligan? You know what a mulligan is? A mulligan in golf is, you get I don't know if the professionals have this, you get one shot. If it's truly horrendous and terrible, doesn't count. One per game. I need 15. But one per game, you get a mulligan. Doesn't count, do over. In Sfirat HaOmer, what happens if you miss one complete day and one night?
You're out.
You're out. No mulligans. Why not? Why no mulligans? I remember, this must have been before I came to London, so about 15 years ago, I was speaking in Israel in the shul. I used to be involved in the shul, and there was no rabbi, so we used to take turns. I got up to speak, and I said, I had heard this in a shiur. I said, there's a Gemara, and the Gemara, I'll tell you in a second. Afterwards, the rabbi comes to me, this guy who prayed in the shul, he's like, it's not a Gemara. I'm like, I think it is. He's like, no, it's nowhere in Shas. So afterwards, I asked him, who's that guy? He's like, oh, that's Rosh Hashiva Rabbi so-and-so. He knows Shas by heart. I'm like, okay, it's not a Gemara. And I went back to find out, it's not in the Gemara. It sounds like it. You'll hear in a second. You'll be like, yeah, it sounds like a Gemara. It's in the introduction to the Nitziv. The Nitziv is a rabbi called Rav Tali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He writes many different books. One of them, I think it was the introduction to the Emek Davar. And he writes in the introduction, he says that they're discussing in the Bet Midrash, what is the most important, what is the most quintessential pasuk in the whole Torah? If you were to pick one pasuk in the whole Torah that is the most important, what would you say it is? Haftarecha kamocha. Stands up one rabbi and he says, V'haftarecha kamocha. And I'm sure all the rabbis in the Bet Midrash are like, that's a good one. Another rabbi says, What's the most important pasuk? What's probably the most famous pasuk? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right? And I'm sure many of the people are like, can't beat Shema. Stands up a third rabbi called Bar Peda, and he says, you know what's the most important quintessential pasuk in the whole Torah? Et akeves echad taseh ba'boker, takeves hasheni taseh b'na'abrayim. You bring the sacrifice in the morning, and you bring the sacrifice in the afternoon. And I'm sure everybody in the Bet Midrash was giving the looks that you're like, how do you compare that to Shema and Ve'ahavta? You're kidding me. Stands up Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the author of the Mishnah, and what does Rabbi Yehuda Nasi say? That pasuk, et akeves echad taseh ba'boker, that is the most quintessential pasuk in the whole Torah. Explains the Netziv why. We're talking about how could. Says, what is that pasuk about? That pasuk is all about the Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice that they brought every morning and every afternoon. And he explains, human nature is, what happens? You get excited. You get inspired. Oh, I'm going to start praying 3 times a day. I'm going to start going to 3 classes a week. I'm going to start that. And then what happens? Life happens. And you get busy. And the baby's crying. And the this and the that. Whatever it might be. And you can't. And then what happens a week later? You forgot about it. I remember a guy came to me, must have been about 10 years ago, and he says, Rabbi, it's been exactly 150 days since we went to Poland. I was like, dude, chill out. You're counting the days? It's exactly 150 days since Poland. He says, you don't remember what you said? I said, I don't usually remember what I said. What did I say? He says, we were in Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, the yeshiva that Rav Meir Shapiro, the founder of Daf Yomi, started. And you said to us, in Poland you get inspired, but what happens like a week after you get back to London? You get back to normal. He said, you told us pick something small, do that consistently. The great thing about Daf Yomi is the consistency. He said, and I decided I'm going to say from the time we get back, 1 chapter of Tehillim every day. And I just finished the whole book of Tehillim. There's 150 chapters, so I know it's been 150 days. I was really inspired. I said, it's probably better than finishing a whole Masechet, because you finish the whole tractate and then what happens? You get on with life. But if you pick something small, that's doable every single day, day in, day out, that's the most important thing. To be consistent. And says Rabbi Nasi, that's the most important pasuk in the whole Torah. Because they're amazing, fundamental us and Hashem, but if we don't have consistency, day in, day out, why is it you can't miss 1 day of Sfirat Omer? There's no mulligans. You know what? Because in growth, you have to understand. It's okay to fail, as long as you learn from your mistakes. But there has to be consistency. Every single day. You can't miss a day. If you want to grow, there's no missing days. Shavuot, the name of the holiday is basically preparation. The name of the holiday is, there's no winging it. You need to prepare yourself. And the amount that you prepare yourself by doing what you ladies doing here today, coming to classes, to open yourselves up, to learn Torah, to show Hashem, you're growing. Every single day, I'm getting another 20 grand. Don't tell your husbands that you're expecting 20,000, right? But every single day, day in, day out, a day of growth. What happens? Slowly but surely, you're being able to receive the Torah. You've prepared. You showed Hashem, I don't just talk the talk, I walk the walk. That's this time of the year is all about. There's more to say. I apologize, I have to run. Be'ezat Hashem, next week we're good? Okay? So, yeah, works for me. Next week we'll continue and we'll discuss another idea to get us ready for Shavuot. But Be'ezat Hashem, the idea of the weeks is all about the preparation.